A killer romance. I'm Jason Horton.
I'm Rebecca Lieb.
And this is Ghost Town.
It was May 1958 at Heathrow Airport. Jerry Lee Lewis was arriving to London for a major tour. A British journalist asked the small girl next to Lewis one question. "Who are you?" She answered simply and honestly saying, "I'm Myra, Jerry's wife." He was not yet divorced, and Myra Brown was his 13-year-old cousin. Today, we're going to talk about the 7 wives of Jerry Lee Lewis. And there are parts that are obviously really bad. There's bad parts, but there's also a testament to this person who's still alive and the time and place of these marriages and these women's stories, which I hope there's not a ton out there for some of them, but you really get a sense of again, like I said, the time and place of things, what music was like, the culture of being married to someone like him, this highly successful, abusive, erratic musician. So I just want to say that before we even get started. Jerry Lee Lewis was a pioneer of rock and roll and rockabilly music. He was known by his concerning nickname, The Killer, which he used weaponized after a while. He was very erratic and would threaten many people, not just the women he was married to. Born in 1935 in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, Lewis began playing piano with his 2 cousins, Mickey Gilley, who went on to be a popular country music singer, and Jimmy Swaggart, who you might know as a pretty iconic televangelist of the 70s. Recognizing his talent, Lewis's parents mortgaged their farm to buy him his first piano. Lewis started recording in the 50s in Memphis with his 1957 hit Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On, making him essentially a breakout star. He followed that song with Great Balls of Fire, also incredibly famous, Breathless, and High School Confidential. I grew up listening to him on the oldies channel in my town's radio. You'd hear it all the time. Soundtracks to things. He, again, as someone who grew up in essentially the 90s, it was still such a big part of my musical childhood. After marrying his second wife, his 13-year-old cousin, which we will get to a little bit more in depth. After marrying his second wife, like we talked about, his 13-year-old cousin, he didn't and couldn't do much in the 1960s. His performances were getting more erratic, wildly energetic, insane, due to lots of things that we'll also get into. He went full country at the end of the 1960s and was known for covering classics in kind of a country style. By 2010, he had a dozen gold records in both rock and country. He had 4 Grammy Awards, including a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award and 2 Grammy Hall of Fame Awards. In 1986, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He has been described as rock and roll's first great wild man and one of the most influential pianists of the 20th century, which is huge and not untrue. But again, this is another reason I wanted to talk about him, in that his personal life really cuts down a lot of his musical achievements, and we can talk about the artist, separating the art from the artist all day, and it's where you choose to draw the line with that with him. So he was a Southern Pentecostal kid who became the masthead of the quote, devil's music, rock and roll. He also was married 7 times, and each marriage ended not, let's say. Jerry Lee Lewis's first wife was Dorothy Barton, the daughter of a preacher. He was just 16 and she was 17. Interestingly enough, he would say that Dorothy was 14 when she was actually 17. Manipulating age would later get him into some trouble. Their marriage lasted from February 1952 to October 1953, 20 months. We don't really know what specifically happened to them, but we can presume that he fell in love with someone else because he literally got married again right after Dorothy Barton. To Jane Mitchum. 23 days before his divorce from Dorothy Barton was final, he married this woman. People doubt its validity because of this, but whatever. They married in October 1957. After 4 years, Lewis filed for divorce. The couple had 2 children, Jerry Lee Lewis Jr. and Ronnie Guy Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis Jr., a musician, a drummer actually, who was in his father's band, struggled with mental health and addiction like his father and would die at age 19 after overturning his Jeep while he was driving and broke his neck. Now let's move on to Lewis's third marriage, which would occur 5 months before his second divorce was finalized. He really just gets into them one after the other. On December 12th, 1957. Everybody warned Lewis not to get married and if he's going to get married, do not take his wife on tour with him. It wasn't public yet, but after Lewis touched down at Heathrow Airport, British journalists swarmed him, asked him who this woman was next to him, and woman, again, being very generous, she was a girl. She answered, "I'm Myra, Jerry's wife." They realized that he had married his 13-year-old cousin once removed, Myra Gale Brown. Lots of problems, obviously. 22-year-old Lewis was then asked how old his new wife was, immediately after she had revealed her name and her relationship to him. He lied and said she was 15. Of course, the truth came to light very soon after. They did some digging, and the press hounded Jerry and Myra mercilessly. Fans were outraged. The tour was canceled after the first 3 shows didn't sell well, and those who attended harassed Lewis, booed him from their seats. They made his tour a hellscape, and he deserved it. In a later interview, now Myra Williams, reflects on that moment in her life. She says, "The only problem was that no one told me anything. So when a reporter asked me, 'Who are you?' I was the one who let the big old cat out of the bag. It was a perfect storm. It couldn't have happened at a worse time, at a worse place. Everything just came together and a major explosion happened." There's one photo that we'll put up. It's what I think about when I think about this marriage. It was taken in May of 1962, right before Myra and Lewis were about to leave for London. It's of Myra, and she's on the runway at Heathrow, and she has a big girl teased haircut, like a woman of that time, like a very fashionable haircut. And she has this little mink stole and these little like kitten heels, and she has shopping bags and a little Bible with her too, and she looks so young, and she's like looking away from the camera. She's like looking like a girl trying to be a grown man's wife, and it's incredibly haunting. Before heading back to Memphis, Jerry Lee held a press conference at the London airport, boasting about his houses and cars and accusing the British of being, quote, "just plain jealous." Went very quickly from getting paid $10,000 a show to playing for $100 at a club. Radio stations stopped playing his songs, and most of Lewis's industry friends distanced themselves or broke ties, except for Elvis Presley, who, unsurprisingly, voiced support for the marriage. Myra later said she'd never shaken off the Jerry Lee Lewis's child bride stigma, though Lewis and some of his friends, talking about it after the fact, stand by the fact that he didn't think that he did anything wrong. In the South, it wasn't super uncommon to marry a cousin, but nobody could really ignore the fact, even if you were cool with that she was 13 years old. It took Lewis almost a decade to rebuild his career, rebranding himself as a country star. The marriage ended in 1970, 13 years later, which is a lot of years to be married to him. Here's Myra again. "It was something that marked Jerry for life. We kept thinking every year, every 6 months, that it was going to go away. They're going to stop talking about it, and it just didn't happen. But it brought me and Jerry very close. We had 10 incredible, wonderful years together after that. We were like a little camp that had been attacked by an enemy, and we held strong to each other and said, regardless of what they do, we're going to keep fighting." Jerry's fame and money went down to almost nothing. It was very turbulent for 10 years, but it was the happiest years of our marriage. So that is troubling. Just the idea of all of this media scrutiny bringing this codependent, captive relationship between this man and this girl together even further. I want to emphasize that this was the only experience of marriage Myra knew, so if she talks glowingly in interviews, which she does, she actually, after the fact, she says a lot of really positive things about their marriage. But a detail that is also very haunting, and not unlike the picture, is after getting married, she joined back up with Lewis to start married life with him. She didn't know what to put all of her possessions in, so she packed them into the only thing that could contain her clothes and things, which was a giant closable dollhouse. So again, picture this like 13-year-old girl carrying around this dollhouse to go meet up with her new husband, who is young himself, but still like legally a man, to be his wife. So in 1970, Myra Brown filed for divorce on the grounds of adultery and abuse. Apparently, they only spent 3 nights at home together throughout their whole marriage. Again, despite what she may have said, because of his hectic touring lifestyle. Lewis was rumored to struggle with addiction and was cheating left and right. Brown charged that she had been, quote, subject to every type of physical and mental abuse imaginable. In fact, he had threatened to kill her on multiple occasions. And there's a lot of pieces of that. So you look at her testimony after the fact, being kind to him, and then you look at other accounts. One time, Jerry surprised Myra at 3 a.m. and complained that there was no dinner. He entered the bedroom and thumped Myra 3 times on the noggin to demand why she didn't arise to serve her master. Startled from her sleep, she lifted her arms to ward off his blow, and struck him. He grabbed her fist and beat her face black and blue. "Look, Phoebe," Jerry said to their 7-year-old, "your mama's gone crazy. She's hitting herself in the face." To deal with that and to be with someone who would do those types of things would be obviously horrible. And 13 years is a lot to think about. They had 2 children, Phoebe Allen Lewis and Steve Allen Lewis, who tragically, Steve Allen Lewis died at 3 years old. He drowned in their swimming pool. Shortly after her divorce, and I'm sure a surprise to like everyone on the planet, Brown married Pete Melito. He was the detective she had hired to trail Lewis and document his infidelities. They moved to Atlanta together. They actually divorced soon after that, and she married a real estate agent named Richard Williams in 1984, and the two run a Century 21 office in Duluth, Georgia together. So she seems happy, at least, after all of that very early trauma. In October of 1971, Lewis married entertainer Jaren Elizabeth Gunn Pate. I couldn't find out a lot about her, but there were a bunch of Pinterest boards with pictures of the two of them, but they were apparently long estranged by 1979, with Lewis having a 3-year live-in girlfriend around that time. Pate and Lewis were weeks away from their divorce settlement being finalized in 1982 when Pate mysteriously drowned in a swimming pool at the home of a friend where she was staying. They had one daughter, Lori Lee Lewis, born less than a year after they were married. Pate was just 39 years old, and while the authorities ruled it an accidental death, it would color Lewis's already tarnished reputation. He couldn't be bothered, though. He was being aggressively sued at the time for tax evasion. And this mysterious death of Pate, of this young woman who, again, very beautiful, very charismatic, would also be fuel for one specific article that I got a lot of information from that talks a lot about perhaps he was a murderer. So again, it's all alleged, but there's certainly a lot of information to color perhaps the way you are viewing these divorces and marriages. Lewis's 5th wife was Shawn Stevens, and it lasted 77 days from June to August 1983 and ended in her death. Shawn Stevens was a waitress in and out of work who landed a job at DB's, a fancy nightclub in the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Dearborn, Michigan. The DB girls were a family, and Jerry Lee Lewis performed for a week at the Dearborn Hyatt. He picked Shawn out from among the girls. Shawn's friend and fellow waitress Pam, who was then hooking up with Lewis's tour manager, set the whole thing up. She told Shawn that Jerry Lee wanted to take her to a party in his suite. Shawn was pretty surprised. The first time she'd seen Jerry Lee Lewis, she told her mother, quote, "Mom, he's a lone man. He's about your age. You ought to come try and meet him." Instead, she went to his suite. Quote, "I always thought Shawn would be good for Jerry," says Pam. "She was so cute, petite, and he likes little women, and she was so much fun to be with. I introduced them. I thought she was flexible enough to understand his moods." Spoiler alert, she was not flexible enough to understand his moods. Really, no one was. Though the night that they met, he was really nice to her, playing piano in his room for her and the DB girls. It was February 1981, and Shawn was only 23 years old. Lewis was 46. And then he invited her on tour, and they became a thing. Lewis liked that Shawn was aggressive and protective of him. A friend and former DB girl, Beverly Lithgow, says, "Shawn told about one of the first times they went out to dinner down there near Memphis, and this girl came over to the table and asked for Jerry Lee's autograph. So he gave it to her. She came back again and started talking with him. So the third time she came back, Shawn finally just grabbed her by the hair and pulled her down and said, 'He's with me tonight, leave him alone.' Shawn said Jerry Lee loved it because she was so forceful." So it's already a recipe for bad behavior and the rewarding of aggression and complacency. The problems didn't end there. When Shawn's sister Shelley came to visit them, at first Lewis was mad because he thought Shelley was trying to find her sister a younger man, and then he was mad that Shelley wouldn't have sex with him. Eventually, after accusing Shelley and Shawn of stealing his jet ski, Shawn left with her sister and shacked up with her ex-boyfriend, a factory worker named Scott, the guy that everyone says in every interview that I've ever read to do research on this piece that she never got over this guy and wanted to be with him. And as soon as she started hanging out with Jerry Lee Lewis, he was like, "I'm not going to take you back. You've made your bed and I can't get involved with this." But Jerry Lee Lewis and Shawn reconvened in July of 1981 when Lewis was in a hospital bed with the most of his stomach gone and less than a chance of living. But they reconvened in July of 1981 with Lewis in a hospital bed. He had most of his stomach lining gone. After a bunch of different stomach problems, they decided to, at that point, just get married. But at Sean's bachelorette party, a friend asked her why she was marrying him at all. She laughed, quote, because he has a big dick and a lot of money. The marriage was really bad. It was withholding, addled with drug abuse, violence, fighting. Once Lewis gave Sean a $500 Lhasa Apso, but days later she had to give it up because Jerry Lee Lewis got jealous of it. He kept pressuring Sean and her sister for sex, withholding money and transportation, being publicly violent towards her and her family. Eventually, at a party, ambulances were given a directive that there was a, quote, unconscious party at the Jerry Lee Lewis residence. When they arrived, Jerry Lee was in another room and Sean was dead. The autopsy says her death was from a methadone overdose, which, according to many, sounded suspicious because she was not a partaker in drugs. She would smoke a little bit of pot, she would drink a little bit, but she wouldn't partake in that. Also, Jerry Lewis was in a different room. He had blood stains on him that they said came from his own cut from a finger, and they didn't really follow up with DNA. It was a lot of things that didn't add up to a lot of people who are still discussing it at this point. Sean was buried in the Lewis family plot. Lewis's sixth marriage was, of course, disturbing in its own way. Carrie McCarver was only 10 when she met Jerry Lee Lewis at a Toys for Tots benefit in Memphis, and it was then that she decided she would marry him. When she was 18, Carrie re-met Lewis in a club, and then they dated, but in 1984, 21-year-old Carrie McCarver married Lewis, and the marriage lasted 21 years. They had a child, Jerry Lee Lewis III. This marriage, after lots of drugs and accidents and health scares, just fell apart. And it just felt like with this marriage, Jerry Lee Lewis was getting older. She was okay with a lot of bad behavior. He was attempting sobriety at certain points. And she just wanted it really badly. Again, having this fascination with this celebrity at 10, it becoming an actualized relationship, and then her kind of buckling up for it. Says Lewis of his marriage to Carrie, quote, I didn't believe this marriage would work out at first. It was so hard for me to believe that it would. But I can see now with my straightening up and getting my act together, maybe that's the problem all along. I don't know. I wasn't really hanging in there. And I was dominating and overbearing and drinking a lot, taking pills. When you're doing that, alcohol will destroy you. So at least he's admitting at this point in all of these marriages that he's doing something wrong. In 1993, Lewis moved his family to Dublin. A lot of people thought it was to avoid more issues with the IRS. He returned to the US in 1997 after his tax issues had somehow just been resolved. Didn't really find a lot of follow-up information on that. In June 2005, they divorced, Carrie and Lewis, and we don't really know why, but I can just imagine she probably had enough. Lewis married his seventh and final wife, I think, Judith Lewis, on March 9th, 2012, at 72 years old. She was his caretaker, and they fell in love. The very next day, Lewis severed business ties with his daughter, Phoebe Lewis Lofton, who was his manager, revoking her power of attorney. In 2017, Lewis sued his daughter and her husband, Zeke Lofton, claiming that she owed him substantial sums of money. In the lawsuit, Lewis, his wife Judith, and his son Jerry Lewis III also claimed Lofton defamed them on Facebook. Lewis, Lofton, and her husband countersued, claiming Judith Lewis and Jerry interfered in their business relationship. In April 2019, it was ruled that the claims were barred by a 3-year statute of limitations, with the exception of some of the defamation stuff. Last year, Lewis turned 85, and he's still making music. He had a birthday live stream airing on YouTube, Facebook, and his official website. The live stream special, called Whole Lotta Celebrating Going On, featured Willie Nelson, Elton John, Priscilla Presley, and was hosted by John Stamos. And that's where we're at today. But again, there's still a lot of rumors going on about what happened with the 2 wives that died. Richard Ben Kramer is a journalist that I got a lot of the information for this episode about, and he, in his Rolling Stone article, really highly insinuates that Lewis had something to do with the death of his wives, and that he absolutely had something to do with the destruction of the lives of many of his ex-wives that were still alive. It's very sad, and he just seems like one of those guys that he's just so not like under the radar. He's on the radar, but we miss a lot of this activity because it's been so long, and because it just feels like his whole musical persona is nostalgic. I don't know.
The movie Great Balls of Fire, I think, really brought him back to public consciousness. From what I remember watching movies and It's played by Dennis Quaid. We were talking about how Dennis Quaid also dates much younger, which I thought was an interesting kind of take. But yeah, I think the thing of Jerry Lee Lewis, I mean, the late 1950s is his apex, but yet he's just the fact that he survived so much for so long where other people haven't. In the 80s, he got most of his stomach removed, and he's like, now at 85, you can see my TikTok. You know? It's an interesting thing that people have given him a pass because they'll always have some kind of celebration with him. And he's really playing. He's got some good songs, and he is definitely a pioneer. Like I said, he's switched to country standards because the British invasion came, music changed, and where does he fit in? Elvis's, you know what I mean? Elvis was not in vogue, and he had to come back in, say 68 and everything like that. So musically, people were like, I don't want to hear rock and roll. Things have changed. We want to hear something more aggressive. And then obviously music has changed a lot, but people have given him a huge pass. And never mind just dating your very young cousin. That is definitely the one thing people remember. But the fact is that he's just not a good person to a lot of people. And we're talking about the 7 wives, but there's probably 7,000 other people he treated like garbage. And not everyone. Some people treat people like, I'm not saying everyone has to be nice all the time, 24/7, but he seems to be like a routine bad boy that people are like I said, Elton John, okay, cool, whatever, I'll help celebrate.
Like, you're part of music history, all of a sudden you get a total pass. Because it's also like when this stuff came to consciousness as being really bad, this is half true because obviously at the time people were like, she's 13 years old, holy shit. But at the time where it really felt like cumulatively bad and this person is an addict and they're abusive, he was already old. He was like not perceived of as the same amount of threatening as he might be in his early years.
And a nostalgia act, like you were saying, comes in and out of consciousness. But I think that movie Great Balls of Fire was one of those things that really brought him. And that movie, from what I remember, wasn't like, it's scathing. It's still a Hollywood movie. It's not like a documentary that, might put out now. It's a pretty much like a kind of a glossed over, he's bad, like she's too young. And it's like,
when did that come out?
I really don't know. I'm going to say 1988, but I really have no idea. I'm usually pretty good at those things, but I remember it coming out, and always he's like a iconic piano player, like bad boy, outlaw, like a little bit of an outlaw. But the fact that we started this in the late 1930s, and you're like, like he's streaming his thing on Facebook and wherever, Twitch, and it's going to his official Twitch channel.
Jesus Christ.
And stuff like that. And listen, I've separated the art from the artist before. There's a lot of musicians that are bad. A lot of them are bad.
A lot of them are bad.
A lot of actors are bad. A lot of musicians are bad. It's you reconcile that in any way you do. But this dude, but I don't know. Nobody really seemed to have stopped him.
Nobody really, and it's not like it was so cultural at this. Like we were talking about all the other musicians that you lump in with this dude, and it's guys, especially at that time, were like allowed to be treating people like shit. If you were not even a musician, you could be talentless and still a white guy and treating people around you like absolute garbage.
Not in LA, you can't. That's not possible.
That's true.
That's the one place you can't do it.
That's very true. But are you gonna stop listening to Great Balls of Fire?